At our house, we've been on a binge of remembering. Sounds really good, doesn't it? What happened was we need to clean out our basement. It was getting a little full. And so I call it the day, the week. Now it's been almost the month of remembrance as we've gone through and cleaned out things that we've been hauling around at our house for the last 45, 50 years. It's just surprising the things that are there. We had that. Connie always says to me, she always goes, I always say to her, where's all this stuff come from? And I kind of say that to her, and she kind of points at me and goes, that's where it all comes from, you, right there. But I have important stuff. I have to keep it around me, just in case I might need something later on. But I tell you that because we've been kind of going through and choosing what it is we want to keep and what it is we want to give away. So Connie has these big black garbage bags. She just throws everything in. She uses black bags. I like to use kind of clear bags. I like to know what I'm throwing away, which isn't much. Connie, she likes to use the dark black bags, so when she throws everything in, those extra large giant bags that hold about 400 pounds each, and she fills those up. And last time we counted and did this little thing, we had 15 bags. Can you believe it? I thought, what in the world are we going to do with 15 bags? My daughter said, you can't put those out in front of where you live. People will think you're moving. So I said, what are we going to do? She said, bring it over to my house, and they'll pick it up. So we drove over there at about 6 in the morning over to her house to pile them out in front so the garbage guy could take them. And we just said, Carly, you helped to supply some of this, so we're going to bring it back to you now. You can have it, and you can give it away as part of that whole process. So in going through, I've been discovering things and finding things, and it's been memories. You ever do that kind of thing? If you're like us, what we do is we keep all that stuff for our kids because one day they're going to want it. Yeah. Last time we did that, we had a garage full. And we said to the kids, this is all the stuff we've been saving for you. And they go, yeah, okay. And we soon discovered that maybe we've been parking that around for the last 40 years for no reason at all. They're like, go on, move it, get it out of here, But then, of course, a lot of that stuff I said before is things that I have, things like beautiful boxes that Connie looks at and says, now, we've been carrying this for the beginning of our ministry. Yeah, that's right. What does it say on the top? Rocks. I like to collect rocks. It's one of those things. And I love it because it reminds me of certain things in my life. When I go out and I visit people's homes, I love it because I love to go into their house and see things they have. They have rocks too. They got little trinkets, little things, pictures on the wall, all that kind of stuff. And I love it because I can go in there and they may not want to tell me a story, but boy, do they ever tell me a story when I ask them about these things in their house. Where does that come from? Oh, that came from... where did that picture on your refrigerator come from? It looks like a beautiful little drawing. That was our granddaughter. You want to know about her? We'll tell you. Before you know it, we have a lot of those things. Isn't that what we fill our house with? Little mementos, little remembrances. And then sometimes we fill them up with so many remembrances that when we get older, we don't even remember why we're hauling them around and keeping them. We forgot about those things, but they're important for us. One of the things I ran across in one of the tubs was a picture, this picture that my grandfather had. My grandfather and grandmother, my grandfather came from Holland, and my grandmother, and in their house, this is the picture that was over their kitchen table. And every time I would go, this is what we would always look at. My grandfather was, a great guy in the church, and all kinds of stuff, but this is important. And I asked him one time, why do you keep that picture up there? And he said, because it looks exactly like my father in Holland when he would pray. And he said, I found that picture, and I wouldn't hold it. And in your little brochure today, it talks about this picture and where it came from, It's the state picture of Minnesota. Did you know, about 1920, a guy named Enstrom put this thing together, shot the picture. It's a peddler that lived not far from him, and it's a photograph of this guy. He took a picture of him as part of that, and then just a short time afterwards, the guy disappeared. No one knows where he ever went to. But that picture remains true for it. I really love that picture. Isn't that just it just kind of puts it all together. And I've already heard from some people today saying, that picture you got here, my parents, my grandparents have that. It's very much a part of it. Those are things of remembrances. They bring back stories for us as part of the whole thing. And I think that's wonderful. That's part of what this one word program that we were in the middle of and starting up, because we want to use one word in order to bring back good remembrances. One of the things Jesus says to us is, the same thing that God said, and that is that one of the things that you have responsibility is to remember. You with me on that? Now, you understand that is an amazing gift, the gift of remembrance. Isn't it really? We remember certain things. Or we say to each other, do you remember when? because we like that. We surround ourselves with pictures, things about remembrances that were important for us in our life and how critical they were. She said that's one of the challenges we have is that we do have a little bit of short memory. Sometimes we just need to remember. That's why over and over again, God says to the people, do this in remembrance of me. He reminds us all the holidays, all the spiritual things that we do. The idea of Christmas is all about remembering. We keep coming back to it. And she said it's one of the shortfalls, not I created, but it's a shortfalls that sometimes you and I fall into, and that is that sometimes we go to God and we go, God, help me in the midst of all this, and all of a sudden God provides a miracle, an answer to it, and what do? We say, God, thank you so much for what you've done. And when the pastor comes over and says, where's God been at work in your life lately? And we go, I don't remember anything real. I get 35 years ago, That's it. It says critically important for us as Christians to always remind ourselves, because we need to be reminded about what God is doing and how God is at work in our life, because that's one of the failures that we have. As soon as things start going good, what do? Yeah. We said, okay, God, I'll handle it from here. Thank you so much. You did a good job, but I can do a little bit better. And I'll come back to you if there's another problem in my life, rubbing the magic lamp of the genie. And that's where God relegates. God says, you know what? I want you to do it over and over again. Throughout Scripture, that's what he kept saying was, you have to remember these things. They're important. A few weeks ago, when we got our we got my one word, and Connie said to me, what's your one word? I said, my word's thought. And she goes, oh, really? That's great. So our lives get busy, and so we started eating at the table. You remember that? It's an old thing that people used to do. But we actually broke, and I tell you, it felt a little queasy. I was like, whoa, I don't know about this. Sitting at a table and eating. Oh, no cell phone. Oh, I don't know how this is going to go. But it was kind of cool. We were sitting there and everything else, and Connie says to me, she goes, did you see it? And I'm like, what? And she said, you're just kidding. I know you saw it. Saw what? Now, if you look on this little insert sheet that you've got, you see this little thing over here on the right-hand side that says thoughts and always. That's my word and Connie's word. Now, it's a chalkboard that we have in our kitchen. Now, you'd probably miss it because it's only about 8.5 foot tall, and it's probably only about almost 5 foot wide. And this is a picture from that chalkboard that Connie lovingly drew all this by. Isn't that cool? Did the whole thing. And I'm sitting at the table, and she says to me, did you see it? And I'm thinking, see what? I should have never answered it that way. I could just feel it go down when I said that. And she said, I go, yeah. And then I thought, she goes, you didn't see it. And I go, I don't know what you're talking about. And she goes, that. Now, I tell you, I could have fallen into this thing. It's so big. And here I am talking about how important it is to keep the one word before us. And here I am when she does this beautiful job. And what's my response? I didn't see it. Now, I want to tell you that, in all honesty, I have a problem with that. Maybe some of you have that same affliction. We just don't see it sometimes. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we don't see the thing God does. Sometimes you don't see the things other people do for us because sometimes we just aren't there. We're too busy, We've got a lot of things going on in our heart and in our lives, and somehow that's it. God said, He said, if you want to talk about growing spiritually, you cannot do it on your own because he said you'll fall back to your own habits. You have to find a way to continue to depend upon me and look and see what it is I'm doing because I want you to. Some of you are with me. I love it. I'll give you everybody a chance. Some of you need to do what? Remember how critically important it is for our lives. To look and to see those things that God has for us and the things that God is doing for us in our life. In the scripture, I referred to it this morning, this Ebenezer building. Jacob has the dream, build a rock pile. The folks come across Joshua takes them across the Jordan River into the promised land. And what do? Take 12 rocks, build them up, and make a little rock pile of it. Do you ever do that at your house? Huh? Okay, for those, I'm going to honestly offer this. It's really not too good right now. It's a little snow, but by the end of the day, probably we're going to have all that snow gone. We'll be able to do it. But sometimes it's important for us to do that kind of thing, to have these things. The whole idea was to build a rock pile and then to leave that pile there so that when your children, I'm interpreting scripture for you, so when the children come around, you as the older adults, elders, are able to answer them when they ask you this question: what is that rock pile for? And you're able to say, let me tell you the story. And you tell the story over and over again. Now in our family, I tell you, it's hilarious. We sometimes say to the grandkids in our room, let me tell you a story about Grandma and Grandpa. And oh, when we tell that story, it's a great one. Unless I say something about Connie, and Connie doesn't want them to know, and all of a sudden they come back and say, Dad, Grandpa told us that story. But it's important to tell our kids stories, isn't it? Isn't that what we do? We tell them what Grandma and Grandpa did, and we talk about how important they were in their life, and they'll remember that, and they'll tell the story, and they continue to tell it. Our son had his birthday this past week, and when he was born 41 years ago, it was in the worst snowstorm in Kentucky history. And we had to take National Guard trucks in order to get into the hospital so that we could have the baby. It was one of those times of remembrance. And this week we were eating with our son, and he says to us, he goes, now tell me that story again about how that happened, how you guys had to get into town, you know. It's amazing how they keep doing that, isn't it? How people do that. Grandma and Grandpa, tell us that story again. Mom and Dad, tell us the story. Tell us about when I was born. Tell us about what happened when that happened, and all of a sudden how God worked. Tell us those stories again. You see, it's not by accident we ask that question. When someone passes away, one of the things I always tell them as a pastor is they may not be in your sight, but guess what? They're always in your remembrance. And that, I say to them, no one can take away from you. You'll always remember. When I used to go to care centers and people would have Alzheimer's and some of those things, you know what? They couldn't remember what they did yesterday. But you get them into this thing and they'll tell you all about what they did back then. If they can't remember it, I just sing them a song like How Great Thou Art. Their face lights up and they go, oh. When I was in Kentucky, I worked at Eastern State Mental Hospital in Lexington. That's where I did one of my clinical residencies. In fact, on my form, I said, I'm happy to work anywhere. And at the bottom it said, where would you never want to work? And I put, at a mental hospital. Guess what? They do that in CPE training. They go, where does he never want to go? That's where we're sending him right there. I remember I got there, and my assignment was to work in a floor of people who were comatose. And there was one of these wards where there were tables upon tables, beds upon beds upon beds. And all of a sudden, they told me I had to go up there and I had to do ministry with those folks. Well, I got ministry with the doctors and all those folks. I did that. But these folks are comatose. They don't move. They don't talk. They're asleep. Nothing happens. And I thought to myself, so I went down and my CPA supervisor said to me, he goes, how's it going up there? I said, doing great. He goes, it is? Yeah. Tell me about it. And I said, well, I know all the doctors. I'm friends with all the nurses. I know everything's going on. He goes, how about the patients? And I said, well, you know. He goes, what does that mean? Well, you know, they're out of it. They can't see anything. They don't know anything. He goes, how are you doing ministry with those folks? I can't. He goes, no, you chose not to. Come with me. And he took a cassette player, and we went outside, got on an elevator, went up to the third floor, came out of the elevator, and walked in, and all of a sudden he goes, come with me, and he walked over to the bed of this lady who was sitting there, put the cassette player down, and hit the button, and all of a sudden they start singing, Amazing Grace. And I thought, what is this all about? And he goes, look at her. And she had tears running down her face. She was comatose. She has no response. Here she was crying when she heard those songs. It's all because of remembrance. That's what God says is so critically important for us to do that, to apply that within our lives. He said, because that's one of the challenges that you and I have. You know, I tell you, there are times when I forget, but I like to put rock piles up. I think it's important to build those things, to remind, to tell the story. And the greatest story of all is when your grandkids come over to your house and say to another grandkid, you want me to tell you the story about what that rock pile is? Now, I'm hoping I plant that in your heart, that when things go good, you'll make those little rock piles. And if you can't do the rock pile, make a rock pile in your house. So that when you or the neighbor comes over and says, why do you have all those rocks there? You can go, sit down, I got a story to tell. That's what the idea of one word is. It gives us one ability, one thing that causes the question to be asked. And in asking the question, we get to tell the story about what that means and what it's about. You know, we move to the next level of telling that story. It's kind of like when you ask somebody a question, how's your relationship with God going? And what do they sometimes say to you? Good. And good. You see, I would love it if in this church people would go around and instead of saying, how's the weather, would say, how's your one word coming along? Because it will start up a conversation that you and I should be having as part of our Christian life each and every day. We should be asking that question of each other. How's your one word coming? What is your word? Tell me about it. How's it going for you? Because it begins to open doors for us to talk spiritual talk, to say the things that we need to say and the words we need to hear. Not just, it's good, but tell me about where are you in that walk, whether it's a struggle, whether it's a challenge, wherever it might be. Tell us about those words. Jesus says to us in Scripture, there's two things that we have to remember. First of all is that one is that we need to remember, and second of all, we need to understand what it means to remain. You know, one of the challenges you and I have in our life is that we sometimes don't remember. We just don't remain in that. We find ourselves just covering it. Like I said at the beginning, we say, God, I got everything together. Everything's working good. I really need your help at that particular point in taking everything together until we need something more and we come back to it. Jesus says that one of the things that you and I as Christians need to do is to remember so that we're ready to share that word with others. It's like what you were talking about today with the family that live up the hill, you know. And then when somebody says, where do they live? And I loved it when you said, next to the other family that we've been praying for, talking about. I thought, yes, success. Yesterday we had a Bible study over at Farrar, and I went to it and everything else, and they asked the person at the very end if they'd like to pray. And I thought, oh man, he said, who would like to pray? And I thought, oh, they're all going to look at the pastor. Instead of doing that, they said to Fred, you know Fred? They said, Fred, how about you praying? Fred goes, okay, I will. And I thought, yay, Fred gets to pray. I don't have to pray. Isn't that great? It's wonderful. And Fred starts to pray. And I was kind of wandering a little bit in my thoughts as he was praying, and all of a sudden he says, and God, I also want to remember and ask for your prayers for those of us who are continuing to work on the one word. Help us to be able to focus on that word and what that means. At the service over in Farrar, I said to Fred, come up here and tell us your story. And he goes, I said, I'll ask you questions, you respond to it. And Fred came up and he began to say, I said, Fred, what's your word? He said, obedience. I said, why is that word important to you? He said, because it's important for me to have that word. I said, do you have a scripture passage with that? And he goes, yeah. He said, you know what? I try to follow, but some of the things I need to learn how it means to obey. I said, that's good. You got a scripture passage? He gave me the scripture passage, and then he said, but I got one better. I said, what's that? It's a song. Trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, trust and obey. And I couldn't stop Fred. He was rolling. He was telling all about this stuff. He was preaching my message. He took over. I thought I'd better sit down and just let him finish. He was telling everybody about trust and obey. And people were shaking their heads. Yeah, I know all about that. And before you know it, people were remembering and reminding themselves of a time when they trusted and when they obeyed and when they learned to trust God and what that meant for them in their lives. Do you hear what I'm saying? And I said, you know, it's amazing because a lot of folks that have been filling out their one word form, they don't give me a scripture passage, they give me a song. Next week, we're going to start singing those songs at both churches because I want to lift that up. I want to make that part of our life. The challenge is that you and I have to that's one of the things we need is to remember and to remind ourselves. So today, we're going to do communion right now. And I have these offering plates. And in these offering plates are, let's try that again. In these offering plates are rocks. Okay, very good. And I think they're pretty cool. And so when you take communion, they're going to take communion and pass it. And then we're going to pass these. And I want you to